Today I'm going to talk about ND filters for the DJI Spark. I'm going to explain what they are, what they do for you, and why you may want to use them. I'm also going to try to clear up some of those basic misconceptions, and hopefully that's going to be good information to help you decide if ND filters are right for you. So yeah, let's get to it. ND stands for neutral density. And basically, an ND filter is designed to reduce the amount of light passing through the lens without affecting the color or hue of that light. That's it. That's all it does. It doesn't improve the quality of that light, nor does it do anything else magical. Nothing else. It just reduces the amount of light passing through the lens. So why do we want to block some light? Well, really, there's only one reason to use an ND filter to reduce the amount of light passing through the lens. And that's so we can use a slower shutter speed to get normal looking motion blur in our footage. That's it. I say normal looking because using a shutter speed of 1 over twice the frame rate has long been an established rule of thumb in filmmaking, and it's what we're used to seeing when watching TV and film. Basically, it's what the pros do. The Spark only shoots video at 30 frames per second, so using this rule of thumb, the optimal shutter speed for capturing normal looking motion blur would be 1 over twice the frame rate, or 1/60th of a second. Now, why can't we just set our shutter speed to 1/60th of a second, launch our Spark, and start capturing amazing cinematic video? Well, most of the time your shutter speed is going to have to be much faster than 1/60th of a second for proper exposure. On cloudy days, we might need a shutter speed of 1/500th of a second or faster, and on really bright sunny days, your shutter speed could be 1/2000th of a second for correct exposure. And that's where the ND filter comes in. We need to block some of that light so we can use a slower shutter speed for natural looking motion blur. Let's look at some examples. The shutter speed for the first shot is 1/500th of a second, and I'm not using an ND filter. So at regular speed, maybe you don't see anything, looks pretty normal. But if we freeze frame or step through frame by frame, you'll see that every single frame is sharp. There is absolutely no motion blur because the fast shutter speed freezes motion. On the next example, same setup, except this time I'm using an ND filter to slow my shutter speed to 1/60th of a second. And again, you may not see it at full speed, but this time when we stop it or step through frame by frame, you can definitely notice the motion blur. So now with a slower shutter speed, we have achieved that desirable motion blur from frame to frame. Let's move on to another example. So this time without the ND filter, my shutter speed is at 1/1250th of a second, and I'm hovering at 50 meters above the highway. And again, at full speed, it looks pretty normal, but when we stop it, you can see the cars are like just dead sharp. There's just no blur at all. Now this clip, I am using an ND filter, and I was able to get the shutter speed down to 1/80th of a second. When we look at the footage, we can see there is definitely motion blur in the car, but because now we're further away from our subject, the motion blur is quite a bit less evident than it was when Jen, Molly, and I were running really close past the Spark. So now I'm going to show you two more clips, and one of the clips I'm using an ND filter, and one of the clips I'm not using an ND filter. The shutter speed in one of the clips is 1/2000th of a second, and in the other clip it's 1/120th of a second, which is the slowest shutter speed I could get with my strongest ND filter. Okay, could you tell which clip was using the ND filter and which clip was not using the ND filter? Probably not. Even though there was a big difference in shutter speeds, there was barely any motion blur perceptible in the clip with the slower shutter speed, which was clip A, by the way. The point I wanted to drive home with these two clips is that the further away you are from your subject, the less evident that motion blur will be, even while using a slower shutter speed. So if your shooting style takes you way up in the air, or you're taking shots with very little motion, ND filters are not going to make much of a difference to the look of your footage. The slower shutter speed will barely be perceptible. You'll know because you use the ND filters, but your viewer probably won't see it. If you've watched some of my other Spark videos, you'll know that I like to fly low and slow and really get up close to things. So for me, ND filters make a lot of sense for the same reason I use an ND filter on my SLR. I want that slow shutter speed, so the motion blur in my shots looks natural. The set of filters I use are the Vivid Collection Cinema Series from Polar Pro. It's a set of 3 filters with different strengths for different lighting conditions. It has an ND4, an ND8, and an ND16 filter. These filters are good for lighting conditions ranging from low light, sunrise, sunset scenarios, all the way up to partly cloudy, partly sunny days. An ND16 filter isn't quite strong enough for really bright sunny days. For that, you'd need an ND32 filter. The great thing about these filters is they are polarized. Polarization reduces glare caused by light bouncing off of pretty much everything around you. Water, buildings, vegetation, and even the ground. You end up with more contrasty, more saturated, and sharper looking images in video. You can really see the difference the polarization makes. The filters weigh almost nothing, and the build quality is really quite good. Installing them is simple, and it's best done with the spark powered off so you don't stress the gimbal. Once installed, they stay in place. I've flown my Spark in windy conditions, I've flown it in sport mode, and I've even crashed with an ND filter installed and it did not come off. Losing a filter was kind of a big worry for me, but so far it hasn't been an issue. Another terrific thing about the Polar Pro filters is they have a companion app for your iOS or Android device. It's free and it helps you select the appropriate filter for your lighting conditions. It also has a bunch of extras like wind conditions, weather, sunrise, sunset times, and even KP index. Now, one downside to this particular collection is the ND16 filter is not quite strong enough for bright sunny days. With our activities, I end up shooting a lot in the middle of the day in bright light, and for that I would need an ND32 filter. Now, Polar Pro does make an ND32 filter. It is not polarized and it comes in a different kit. My only other quibble is the polarizing filter can be a little fiddly to adjust. Now, the filter is rotatable so you can adjust the strength, but there's no markings to tell you kind of where you're at. So what I have to do is I have to take it off my Spark, I put it up to my eye, and then I kind of dial it in to where I think is just right, and then I have to reinstall it. If I need to make an adjustment, I've got to take it off and do that whole process all over again. That's kind of a bit of a pain, but thankfully I don't have to do that too often. Overall though, I think the Polar Pro Vivid Collection Cinema Series filters are a great addition to any Spark owner's kit. Even if you're not concerned about motion blur or slowing that shutter speed down, I think the polarization itself, it just makes a big difference to the look of your footage, and for that alone, I think it's definitely worth it. Well, that's it for this one, guys. I hope that helped you to understand what ND filters do and how they can affect the look of your drone footage. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and yeah, you guessed it, I will see you in the next one. Look at that, I turned it so much I can't even see. Cool.